Good morning. I'm really so glad to be here presenting this today, and I'm sorry that we couldn't do it in person. I hope that this finds you healthy and at peace in your lives. This talk I call Driving Old Fort Road, and it's a story of my journey of understanding related to intergenerational trauma. It's only in the winter that I can actually see the lake from my house. There's a lot of trees in the way, but early in the morning, in the winter, I can stand at the windows and look to the southwest, and I can see the water shimmer off the lake, or in January, off the ice. It shimmers like silver through the trees. For many years, I didn't know what the name of the lake meant. I honestly didn't give it much thought. We live in Minnesota, and we live on about 10 acres where we make maple syrup. And it's part of a land that used to be called the Big Woods. It's a large expanse of deciduous hardwood that was part of the land when the European settlers came. In my capacity as a social worker and parent coach, I worked with some families of Dakota Sioux who bear the contemporary scars of the terrible history of settler colonialism in Minnesota. These families live near the Lower Sioux Reservation. That 10 acres of land, it's really theirs. And the lake, Mazaska, was theirs. Mazaska, meaning white iron, is the Dakota word for silver. This story is my experience that brought into focus several ideas and concepts that I understood on a cognitive level, but I realized I really didn't get. My story begins in 1965 when I was born. I grew up in a family that was very interested in Native American culture, and we learned a lot about it as we were growing up. My mom and maternal grandparents in particular were influential in that way. We would go to powwows at Oneida. We'd go to museums, archaeological sites, contemporary pueblos. So that was always part of my life as I grew up. And when my mom remarried, the family included my stepsister, who is an enrolled member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, or the Winnebago, and was adopted in about 1970. I learned more about the cultural ways and complex history of Western Indigenous tribes when I was in college. And then in graduate school, I learned about the boarding school era, public policies influenced by manifest destiny, and the eventual passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So I knew that Native Americans were not peoples of the past. They were also peoples of the present and the future. But I didn't get it. See, it wasn't until I started teaching in Mankato when I learned of the U.S.-Dakota conflict of 1862. And I was amazed that I hadn't learned about it before. Our stories and our history books are filled with what Dunbar Ortiz calls the U.S. origin myth, and I realized that I had completely bought into the myth. I finally asked myself, hey, were my ancestors some of those people here at the time of the U.S.-Dakota conflict? My maternal side of the family, Karen's family, are all from southern Minnesota. That conflict resulted in the largest mass execution ever carried out in the U.S. and the forced removal of not only the Dakota but also the Ho-Chunk peoples from southern Minnesota. So I did some more ancestry research, and it turned out that the answer to the question was yes. Some of my maternal ancestors had settled and were living and farming on these very lands right where all of this happened, when it happened, more than 100 years before I was born. And over time, that entire story has come full circle. My story, I now realized, as a white-bodied woman, was about immigration, but it was also about settler colonialism, cultural genocide, and government-sanctioned terror, which left hundreds of thousands Native Americans and their descendants forever changed at the epigenetic level. So the bigger picture I'm going to present, I'm going to begin with 1850. So come with me on a little history lesson. A vast area known as the Minnesota Territory. The territory had a non-Indian population in 1850 of less than 7,000, and the Native American population was estimated to be about 32,000. White settlers from the East and European immigrants were eager to establish homelands on the frontier, on the prairies, and in this very fertile farmland. They were drawn by offers from land speculators and the government that wished to establish a stronghold in this new frontier. Pressured by traders and threatened with military force by the U.S. government, the Dakota Sioux ceded nearly all of their land in Minnesota and eastern Dakotas in 1851. These treaties meant that some 21 million acres was taken from them for about 7.5 cents an acre. Some of these funds were set aside to pay debts claimed by traders, establish schools, prepare new reservation areas, and for their relocation. The U.S. government kept more than 80% of the money and put it aside to collect interest to pay the Dakota over time. While they were allowed to live on their land that set aside for the reservation, it was tentative because if that land was needed for more white settlement, they would have to move. To help with this, the U.S. government built Fort Ridgely to be able to keep a watch on the land and on the Dakota. By 1855, other tribes followed suit and ceded land in Minnesota to the U.S. government in similar deals. And it was also about this time that the first German settlers came through Chicago and Cincinnati and other places to establish the city of New Ulm, 35 miles from what was the Lower Sioux Reservation. It turns out that in that same year, 1855, a Scrip Warrant Act was passed. And this meant that the government could award bounty land to U.S. military veterans and their heirs. In this way, the government assured the land recently obtained from the Native American tribes would be owned by either the government or those that they gave it to or sold it to. Land was now property, and sale meant profit, and the federal coffers were low. Under this act, a plot of nearly 120 acres was given to an infantry private named Conrad Hager, who had served in the Maryland militia during the War of 1812. Though there was no evidence that anyone of the Hager family ever resided on this land, within 6 years it would be owned by one of our ancestors. Moving along just a little ways to 1858, Minnesota became a state. A group of Dakota leaders traveled to Washington, D.C. to discuss the situation on their reservations given the new statehood. They were pressured again to cede more lands, this time receiving 30 cents an acre. Well, slightly better than before, but still only a fraction of the value that speculators were selling land for. When the funds were finally distributed 2 years later, most of the meager proceeds again went to pay debts claimed by traders. Now the Dakota had virtually nothing, only a small strip of land, no longer had access to the land that they had hunted on for generations, such as the area of the Big Woods, and they had to rely on treaty payments now for survival, money and goods, which often arrived later than promised. So now we're in 1858. The state of Minnesota is half the size of the original territory. In the 1860 census, what we learn is that the population of whites, many whom were German or Scandinavian immigrants, had swollen to nearly 170,000 people in 10 years. That's 28 times more than 1850. And the Indian population was, of course, only a fraction of its original size, due to flight, relocation, and the new western state boundary. So, into this situation comes a probably relatively unknowing, unsuspecting German immigrant family led by Heinrich Johann Gronholz. Along with several brothers and others, a group of northern German immigrant settlers came to Minnesota. His daughter, Katrina Elizabeth, would later marry Dietrich Strauss, and their daughter is my great-great-grandmother, Karin's great-grandmother. They settled to live, farm, and raise children and worship in a town called Cortland, Minnesota, less than a mile from the Minnesota River and about 7 miles from the newly established German enclave of New Ulm. By June of 1861, a land deed was filed in the St. Peter Land Office, indicating that Conrad Hager, who had owned the land through military warrant, had transferred ownership of 120 acres of land to Henry Gronholz. However, by the summer of 1862, just a year later, the growing Gronholz and Strauss families had at least 25, maybe 30 people among them farming on adjacent land. That year, while the U.S. was embroiled in the Civil War, there was anger, frustration, and desperation rising among the Dakota in Minnesota. The population of European settlers had exploded onto that land and was continuing to encroach on the small parcel that they owned. About 40 miles from my ancestors' farms to the northeast along the same Minnesota River, a conflict broke out. The Dakota were starving due to the broken treaty promises, delayed needed provisions and annuity payments. This deprivation and betrayal of the treaties by the U.S. government essentially led to the beginning of the U.S.-Dakota conflict of 1862, which only a very small portion of the Dakota actually participated in, and it lasted for only 6 weeks. But it took the lives of over 500 settlers and probably 200 Dakota. During the battles and other attacks, my ancestors' Cortland area neighbors were killed, and there were multiple battles in and around the town of New Ulm. Once standing in the Cortland Cemetery and looking to the west, I realized that they could have seen the smoke and the fires burning in New Ulm. Most of the families in this area fled. Some later returned. This was likely terrifying and traumatic for these new German immigrants at the time. For them, this trauma was something that might find ways that they could move on from. Yet they too were touched by the trauma of white supremacy that underpinned the conflict. In the fall of 1862, then, after that conflict, nearly 400 Dakota men were tried in a highly biased U.S. military commission. Over 300 were sentenced to die, and President Lincoln finally pardoned many of them. But 38 Dakota men were hanged in Mankato. The condemned were marched along the common road trade routes and through towns and villages where they were jeered and taunted. Nearly 2,000 elderly women and children were forced to then march to Fort Snelling, U.S. fort built in what is now St. Paul, at a place the Dakota called Bedote, the site of their origin myth, where the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers meet. The remaining Dakota were sent to prison in Iowa, to reservations at Crow Creek in South Dakota, and at Santee in Nebraska Territory. By the end of 1863, the Dakota were forced to give up all of their remaining land. Most of the Dakota and even the Ho-Chunk in southern Minnesota, who were not even party to the war, were forced to leave. That year, having pushed the Dakota out of the state, Redwood Falls was founded, 6 miles from the reservation area. There is a large park there today named after Alexander Ramsey, Minnesota's first territorial governor, first state governor, and later U.S. Senator. Though deeply respected for many years, he is now condemned for his role in the removal of the area's indigenous residents from their homelands. So, by 1870, there were reported to be a mere 700 American Indians living in the state. It's unclear how these numbers were generated, but it is clear that the traumas of this period continued to impact the Sioux Nation, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota diaspora across the United States. And this wasn't the only thing. Marionette Pember writes that most Native American families and all Native American communities were touched by the trauma of the boarding school era, which lasted from 1860 to 1978. The Dakota, of course, were among them. These schools were set up to civilize Native American children, or in the words of one of their founders, kill the Indian to save the man. What civilizing was like, actually, Pember writes, included something like the following. Students were stripped of all things associated with their native life. They were stripped of their names, their long hair, their clothing, their food. They were taken from the only people and stripped of the only language that they had ever known. They were subjugated to institutions influenced by strict military regimentation. Students were physically punished for speaking their own language. Contact with family and community was highly discouraged or forbidden altogether. Survivors have described a culture of pervasive physical and sexual abuse at the schools. Food and medical attention were often scarce, and many students died. Often their parents only learned of their deaths after they were buried, sometimes in unmarked graves. So perhaps what is more amazing than learning about my story is that the Dakota Sioux families and their children still exist. They're still contributing to the state of Minnesota and other places. Many returned to the state and now comprise communities near Redwood Falls, Red Wing, and Shakopee. Despite years of removal to boarding schools and then also public child protection to foster care and adoption, there is a resurgence now in teaching cultural heritage and language. These are a resilient people and proud, despite a long litany of trauma, from contact and colonization, forced removal, boarding schools, to unjust policies, contemporary sex trafficking, substance abuse, and endemic racism. At no time did I come more fully aware of this than when I was driving my route on Old Fort Road. This road, the old stage and horse route from St. Peter to Fort Ridgely, and in the areas of the expanse of the Minnesota River Valley and present to the west. One woman I worked with, Teresa, was in her late 30s. Her mother was Dakota, her father Mexican. Her parents were no longer together, and her mother's partner was also Native. Teresa had 5 children, but when I began working with her, only one was living with her. Her 4 daughters had been taken from her care after her estranged husband had been abusive, and the child protection believed she could not protect her children. 2 of them were placed in foster care with her mother, the other 2 with other relatives who were sexually abused. Teresa herself had been sexually and physically abused as a child, as a teen, and an adult. She had spent time in foster care, juvenile detention, and in prison. At one point in our discussion, she shared with me that both her mother and grandmother had also been abused, and that many relatives had been in Native American boarding schools. On her mother's side, she was descended from those very families that were split apart and forcibly relocated in the late 1800s. And she and I were making a healing connection, which continued for over a year. I accompanied her to court and had the privilege of being part of very important dialogues about her family and the reunification with her children. I was floored when this woman, who carried herself with a hard exterior, softened and even cried in my presence. The biggest gift that I got through this was when she told me, "I'm so sad that you're leaving your job. You're one of the only people that I've been able to trust in my life." During these drives, especially on my way home afterward, I had a lot of time to contemplate my heritage, the land, and my place on it. At one point on one of those drives, as I looked across the expanse of fields and the valley of the Minnesota River, I became overwhelmed with grief. It hit me pretty hard in the gut. I was crying. I even had to pull over. I physically live and work on a land that was stolen from people whose ways and very existence my government tried to eradicate. And through this, my European immigrant ancestors passed along land and some measure of prosperity to the next generation. I was here now working to rebuild some of the families whose ancestors had lost their connections in those transactions. Well, it was nearly 150 years ago when the U.S.-Dakota conflict occurred. It was not the first, nor would it be the last time that trauma impacted both my ancestors and my clients. We're still struggling with that legacy. In reality, we all struggle with the legacy, among others, such as slavery. As Resmaa Menakem states, in America, nearly all of us, regardless of our background or skin color, carry trauma in our bodies around the myth of race. He clearly argues that throughout our history as a nation, white-bodied people, those of Anglo-European descent, have colonized, oppressed, brutalized, and murdered black, brown, and indigenous ones. Today, due to the amazing wonders of science and neuroscience, we understand far better that the results of such historic trauma are not only social, psychological, and economic, but they're also genetic. Adverse childhood experiences, coupled with extraordinary attempts at genocide at a communal level, have left many Native Americans extremely vulnerable. And this is only one of the group that's impacted by these experiences that reaches intergenerationally. Over the past decade, we've been learning more and more about the importance of understanding this intergenerational trauma. It's not just historic or social in nature. Trauma affects our minds, our bodies, our being, and how we relate to one another. Epigenetics is translated to above the genes. It is a study of changes in organisms caused by modification of gene expression rather than alteration of the genetic code itself. Scientific inquiry and study is exploring that what is passed along or inherited at this level of genetic expression. It suggests that our genes can carry markers of trauma experienced by our ancestors, which then influence how we react to trauma and stress, and how our bodies react as well. The idea is that traumas and stressors experienced by earlier generations can actually influence whether there's a gene switched on or off. Pember explains the dominant culture perpetuates this mass trauma on population in the form of colonialism, slavery, war, or genocide. And next, the affected population shows physical and psychological symptoms in response to this trauma. Finally, the population directly impacted passes those responses of trauma on to subsequent generations, who in turn may display similar symptoms and many health problems. What happens? Well, we see higher rates of addiction, mental illness, suicide, and physical illnesses such as diabetes or heart disease. For my ancestors who experienced stress and trauma of immigration and the fears of the 1862 uprising, their traumas may not have been as pervasive, persistent, or endemic as those for Teresa's family and her entire nation. Her family members continued to face racism in schools, while shopping at Walmart, and each time they drive past the sign of the huge park in town named after the governor who drove their people out of the state. Yehuda and colleagues have reviewed the scientific literature on epigenetics and have concluded that the science is still very tentative on how this works in humans. But, she says, there is converging evidence supporting the idea that offspring are affected by parental trauma exposures occurring before birth and possibly even before their conception. On the simplest level, the concept of intergenerational trauma acknowledges that exposure to extremely adverse events impacts individuals to such a great extent that their offspring may find themselves grappling with their parents' or grandparents' post-trauma state. She also points out that we have much to learn about the actual mechanisms. However, Pember and others who are aware of historical trauma and accounts passed down through oral tradition in the Native American communities might call historic trauma. They don't find these things surprising at all. Yehuda notes, it's important to underscore the lack of permanence of effects once environmental conditions are altered, which means, essentially, that nurture and environment interacts with nature and biology. And that means that through various types of social engagements, from dancing and drumming, to resuming traditional healing rituals, to coaching parents about how trauma has impacted them and their children. Through these things can improve, people can heal. For me, this journey of self-discovery and embodying social justice is not as much about the ends as the means, less the product, more the process. My understanding of intergenerational trauma has been long and at times painful. Painful in that I've had to intentionally bring myself to face my own white body supremacy and to recognize that the physical space, the land I inhabit today, is really not my own, really nor my ancestors, rather the land of indigenous peoples from whom it was taken. I'm having to find the courage to get past my shame and fragility to learn to deal with what Resmaa Menakem calls the clean pain of the truth of the white body ancestry that I have. It is said in some Native American traditions that the decisions we make today should be made keeping in mind what will be sustainable 7 generations in the future. It was about 7 generations ago that my ancestors came to Minnesota. I am here because of the decisions that they made. I don't know if the decisions made by the Dakota at that time had this in mind, but the decisions made by many others certainly did not. It's my belief that it is now time for me to heal from holding the trauma of my ancestors, in hopes that things will be better in 7 generations. Perhaps it is that time for all of us.